When he dies at 48, the entire country will lower its voice. Yet for most of his short life, Gopal Krishna Gokhale will be just a thin, bespectacled man in the third row, speaking so softly that even the front bench has to lean in to hear him. In an age of firebrand shouters and street-shaking slogans, he will try to win India's freedom with a pencil, a ledger, and a whisper. And standing across from him, like a storm facing a lamp, will be his greatest rival, Bal Gangadhar Tilak, louder, fiercer, and frighteningly popular. Two men, one enslaved nation, and not enough time for both paths to succeed. But that is the future. In the winter of 1866, there is only the silence of a small village in the Ratnagiri district, a thatched roof that leaks during the monsoon, and a newborn boy whose lungs sound too weak even for a cry. They name him Gopal. The world he opens his eyes into is shrunken and narrow, a strip of red earth between the Western Ghats and the Arabian Sea, where the sun is unforgiving and opportunity even more so. His family is Chitpavan Brahmin, but the word Brahmin here doesn't mean luxury. It means a few tattered books, a threadbare prestige. A constant hunger kept barely at bay by his father's modest job as a clerk in the British administration. Picture the house. Walls baked by the sun until they crack like old parchment. A kitchen that smells of smoke and boiled rice, and in the corner, neatly wrapped in cloth, the family's greatest treasure, a handful of Marathi and Sanskrit texts that have passed from hand to hand, generation to generation. For Gopal, those books are not objects. They are escape hatches. He is small for his age, often ill, his ribs visible when he lifts his shirt. In any other time, in any other family, a boy this delicate might be wrapped in cotton and protected from the world. But Gopal has a different shield, a mind that refuses to let go. By the time he is old enough to sit properly, he is already under the dim, flickering light of an oil lamp, tracing letters in the dust with a twig while his father returns from work, shoulders bowed from a day spent copying reports for British superiors who don't bother to learn his name. The boy watches closely as his father folds himself over papers written in a foreign script, English, and something ignites in him. Something like anger and fascination braided together. Why do these strange words give the white men so much power? In those evenings, there is one sound that Gopal comes to hate, the snap of the oil lamp sputtering out too early because they cannot afford more oil. In that sudden darkness, with the taste of paraffin still sharp in the air, he can feel time slipping away. Every minute without light is a minute he cannot read, cannot learn, cannot climb out of this cramped life. The race against time begins here in the dark. News from the outside world reaches the village in broken fragments. A traveling trader mentions a queen in faraway London. A priest repeats rumors of new taxes. An old soldier, drunk on cheap liquor, mutters about the ghosts of 1857, of rebels hanged from banyan trees and cannon mouths stuffed with human bodies. Gopal listens to it all and files it somewhere inside, not yet understanding that these stories will one day become the fuel of his politics. For now, his first battlefield is school. He walks miles to the local pathshala, sometimes on an empty stomach, his feet cracked and dusty. The lessons are mechanical, the cane quick to land on a trembling hand that fails to remember. But the boy absorbs everything, words, rhythms, even the teacher's frustrations. He is not content with learning. He wants to know why learning itself feels like rebellion. A turning point comes when his father, recognizing a fire he himself never had the chance to feed, makes a decision that tears at the family's fragile budget. They will send Gopal, the second of their children, to a larger town for further study, Kolhapur and later Pune. It means less food, tighter belts, and a future built on hope instead of certainty. For a poor Indian clerk in the 1870s, it is an act of insane courage. Gopal is barely a teenager when he steps into Kolhapur and then Pune, places that to him feel like entire planets. The streets throb with color and noise, bullock carts creak alongside British carriages, and for the first time he sees the empire, not as an abstract idea but as a living arrangement. White faces in spacious bungalows, brown faces in crowded lanes. At the English school in Pune, he confronts his first true antagonist, the language itself. The letters are unforgiving. The grammar is a maze. His tongue stumbles over the and W like a child learning to walk. He watches as classmates from wealthier families hire tutors, buy textbooks, and most importantly, have the leisure to practice. Gopal, by contrast, tutors younger students after class just to earn enough to survive, his days stretching into nights, his nights collapsing into exhausted sleep on a thin mat. His body, already frail, begins to protest. There are days when he coughs until his chest burns, nights when he wakes up shaking, unsure if from fever or fear. Somewhere deep down, an ugly suspicion grows. What if his body runs out before his mind can finish its race? The time limit he will carry all his life whispers its first warning, and yet he refuses to slow down. He sits in the back of classrooms, absorbing not only the lesson but the hidden architecture of power, how British teachers praise the docile and mock the questioning, how they use language as a weapon of exclusion, how they cloak prejudice in civilizing mission rhetoric. Every slight, every joke at the expense of natives files itself away behind his calm eyes. In these formative years, Gopal encounters a name that will later loom in his life like a mountain: Bal Gangadhar Tilak. Tilak, a few years older, is already a legend in Pune's academic circles. Stories about him move through the corridors. A student who challenged British professors, a mind as sharp as a blade, a temper to match. Where Gopal is quiet intensity, Tilak is thunder. In the crowded tea stalls near the school, boys argue about who will change India: the radicals like Tilak who demand immediate action, or the invisible ones like Gopal who sit silently, absorbing, calculating. No one yet knows that these two trajectories will one day collide in a conflict that will split the Indian National Congress itself. Gopal's first big examination, the matriculation, approaches like a storm. Failure is not an option. The family has poured everything into this boy. If he falls now, there is no second attempt. Nights blur into each other as he pores over English texts, his eyes red, his fingers stained with ink. The oil lamp burns lower and lower, the flame shrinking just as his window of opportunity narrows. During one of these nights, an almost cinematic image. The lamp goes out, and in the sudden darkness, the boy gropes for his books, refusing to accept defeat. Outside, the moon hangs low and pale. He drags his mat closer to the doorway, angles his books to catch the faint silver light, and continues reading. Hours later, a neighbor wakes to find him still there, lips moving silently over English sentences, as if chewing them into something he can digest. He passes. Not only passes, he excels. For a family on the edge of poverty, his result is a miracle. For Gopal, it is a key. The success opens the door to the prestigious Elphinstone College in Bombay, and later to the Deccan Education Society in Pune, institutions that will shape a generation of Indian leaders. Bombay hits him like a tidal wave. The harbor is a forest of masts and smokestacks, the streets a constant movement of bodies and smells, coal, sweat, spices, the metallic tang of industry. Here, the British Empire is at its loudest. Merchants, civil servants, soldiers, all convinced of their destiny to rule. But in the shadow of their buildings, something else is stirring. A new class of Indian that Gopal is becoming part of: the English. Educated middle class, armed with logic, statistics, and a dangerous sense of injustice, it's in this environment that he first hears the economic critique that will haunt him. The idea that India is being systematically drained of its wealth to fuel Britain's prosperity. He reads Dadabhai Naoroji's writings, those cold, precise numbers that reveal a horrifying truth. The empire is not just ruling India, and it is slowly bleeding it dry. The realization hits him not as a distant theory, but as something he can map onto his own life. Every unpaid night of study, every skipped meal, every sacrifice his family made fits neatly into the larger pattern. Millions like him squeeze so a distant island can shine. Somewhere between classroom lectures and late-night readings, Gopal makes a decision that will lock him onto a path with no easy exits. He will not just study the empire. He will confront it, but how? Not with guns, he has never held one. Not with speeches that shake the street. His voice barely carries across a hall. His weapons will be subtler and, in his mind, stronger. Figures, arguments, and an unshakable moral center. Where others will shout, he will persuade. Where others will burn, he will endure. This choice alone sets him on a collision course with men like Tilak, who are even now sharpening a different strategy: boycott, agitation, defiance. The rivalries of the future begin as unspoken differences in the minds of young men listening to the same lectures, reading the same British textbooks, yet imagining wildly different endings. After finishing his studies, Gokhale returns to Pune not as the fragile village boy, but as part of a small radical experiment, the Deccan Education Society. Established by a group of idealists, including Tilak, it aims to create an Indian-run system of education, free from British control. The classrooms are modest, the salaries meager, but the ambition is huge, to shape minds that will question, resist, and ultimately transform their enslaved country. Here, Gopal finds his first true mentor, Mahadev Govind Ranade. Ranade is everything Gopal aspires to be. Calm, precise, steeped in both Western liberalism and Indian tradition. A judge by profession, a reformer by passion, he believes in patience, in gradual change, in the power of institutions. In Ranade's study, surrounded by stacks of books and the ticking of a clock, Gopal is introduced to a world of ideas, constitutionalism, economic critique, social reform. The older man immediately sees something unusual in the pale, intense young teacher. Where others are eager to argue, Gopal is eager to understand. Where others seek the spotlight, he seems almost to avoid it. Yet when he speaks, Ranade notices the room shifts. People lean in. Not because his voice is loud, but because his words are careful, weighted, and impossible to dismiss. Ranade begins to mold him gently but firmly. Statistics, he tells Gopal, are a moral weapon. The British pride themselves on reason, use their own language, their own numbers to show them their injustice. Under this mentorship, the young man's political vision sharpens. He starts paying attention not just to the abstract idea of freedom, but to the concrete machinery of oppression, how taxes are levied, how revenue is spent, how famine relief is administered or cruelly withheld. He learns to read budgets as if they are crime scenes, every line item a clue. And all the while, the clock keeps ticking. Gokhale is in his 20s, but his health is already an old man's. The slightest chill gives him fever. Long journeys exhaust him. On some mornings, he wakes with a heaviness in his chest that feels like a hand pressing down. Doctors warn him, quietly but clearly, this pace is not sustainable. He will not live long if he does not rest. Rest, while India gasps under the weight of an empire. The warning does not slow him, it accelerates him. If his time is limited, and he senses with a clarity that borders on the prophetic that it is, then every year must carry the weight of 10. Every speech, every article must dig a little deeper. He begins to write. His first political essays appear in newspapers, modest in appearance but explosive in content. He dissects government policies with surgical precision, exposing the cruelty hidden behind bureaucratic language. He does not yet have a national audience, but in Pune's tight intellectual circles, a reputation is slowly forming. Gopal Krishna Gokhale, the quiet raiser. Tilak, meanwhile, is following his own trajectory, his own rising star fueled by an altogether different energy. Where Gokhale attends meetings in neat, plain clothes, debating resolutions, Tilak organizes public festivals, turns religious gatherings into political theaters and coins slogans that ordinary people can shout in the streets. They are colleagues, sometimes collaborators, yet the line between them, moderate and extremist, constitutionalist and agitator, is already faintly visible, like a crack forming in a seemingly solid wall. The stage of Indian politics is being assembled plank by plank, and both men are walking toward it from opposite sides. Gokhale's first true step onto that larger stage comes with his entry into the Indian National Congress. For a young man from a poor coastal village, the Congress sessions are almost unreal. Great halls draped in cloth, delegates from every corner of the country, the air buzzing with hope and frustration. There, under fans that creak slowly in the heat, Indians stand up in front of other Indians and say what would once have been unthinkable, that British rule must change, that India must have a voice. When Gopal attends his first Congress session, he is not a star. He is one among hundreds, a delegate whose name no one outside his circle recognizes. But as he sits, notebook open, listening to speeches that range from fiery to fumbling, he feels something click into place. This chaotic, imperfect, fragile assembly is where his life's race will be run. He knows his disadvantages. He is not charismatic in the usual sense. He does not command crowds by sheer presence. He is frequently unwell. And somewhere out there, men like Tilak are already capturing the public imagination with a very different message, that the time for talk is over, that only direct confrontation will break the chains. Gokhale looks around at the sea of faces, at the banners, at the dust motes floating in the light streaming through high windows, and makes an internal vow. He will give the moderate path its best possible champion before death taps him on the shoulder. He will test, to the very last breath, whether reason and persuasion can bend an empire. There is no guarantee he will win. In fact, as history will show, his rival will often seem stronger, louder, more beloved. The people will cheer Tilak's defiance while Gokhale is mocked as too loyal, too soft, too English. Every compromise he suggests, every constitutional reform he supports, will be attacked by both the British, who want to give nothing, and the radicals who demand everything now. But all that still lies ahead. For now, we leave him there, a young man in a crowded Congress hall, pen poised above paper, heart already aging faster than his years, eyes fixed not on the applause of the present but on a distant, uncertain future in which a quiet voice might yet change the fate of a nation. Imagine a room where 100 British officials sit in starched collars, bored and confident, thinking they have heard every complaint India can possibly throw at them. Then a thin, tired-looking Indian in a simple coat rises, adjusts his spectacles, and the room goes so silent you can hear the paper rustle in his shaking hands. His voice is soft, almost fragile. But within 10 minutes, men who rule over 300 million people are shifting uncomfortably in their seats because this quiet man is using their own numbers, their own reports to prove that their government is starving his country. In a few years, they will dread his budget speeches. But the road to that room does not begin in the corridors of power. It begins back in Pune, in the dust and noise after that first overwhelming session of the Indian National Congress, when Gopal Krishna Gokhale walks out of the hall knowing one terrifying thing: he does not have time. By now he is in his mid-20s. His cough is more frequent, his chest feels tight on cold mornings. The doctors do not make dramatic predictions. They simply give the same quiet advice again and again. You must not overwork. He hears it, nods politely, and then walks faster. He returns to Ferguson College and to the Deccan Education Society with a new urgency. By day, he is still the earnest mathematics teacher in a simple dhoty coat, explaining equations to sleepy boys. But by night, the classroom turns into a war room. Under the pale flame of a lamp, he and a few like-minded friends spread out government blue books, budgets, census reports, dry documents that most people ignore. Gokhale does not ignore them. He attacks them. Line by line, he begins to understand how the machine of empire really works, how much land revenue is squeezed from peasants, how much is spent on the army, how little on education or famine relief. He sees on paper a reality more brutal than any slogan. In some provinces, less than 1 rupee per person per year is spent on the welfare of Indians, while 10-20 times that amount is spent to keep the empire's army ready. Numbers become his ammunition. Every statistic he copies into his notebooks is a future bullet. At the center of this transformation is still Mahadev Govind Ranade. In Ranade's study, between shelves groaning with books and the ticking of a European clock, the older man pushes the younger one harder. You have a gift for seeing patterns, Ranade tells him. The British pride themselves on figures, make them prisoners of their own arithmetic. But Ranade pushes him in another direction as well, straight into the burning heart of social reform. Outside the polite rooms of Pune's educated elite, India in the 1880s and 1890s is still a place where a girl can be married at 10 and pregnant at 11. Widows, some barely teenagers, have their heads shaved and their colors taken away, condemned to a lifetime of ritual humiliation, child marriage, dowry, caste cruelty. These are not theoretical issues for Gokhale. He has seen their impact in the villages of his childhood. When the Prarthana Samaj and reformers around Ranade speak up, they are not talking about abstract progress. They are trying to pull millions of lives out of the mud. Then, in 1891, the age of consent controversy explodes. The British government, under pressure from horrified missionaries and a few Indian reformers, considers a law to raise the age at which a husband can legally consummate marriage with his wife from just 10 to 12. 2 fragile years, that is all. You would think it a small, obvious step. It is not. Across Western India, conservative leaders thunder against it. They denounce it as an attack on Hindu religion, as foreign intrusion into sacred custom. And at the head of this storm, in Pune itself, stands Bal Gangadhar Tilak. Tilak's newspapers, Kesari and Maharata, roar with editorials that turn the proposed law into a symbol. If the British can touch this, they can touch anything. Crowds are stirred not by the details of the legislation, but by the idea that outsiders are daring to legislate Hindu life. On the other side of the street, in much smaller meetings, Gokhale and Ranade argue for reform. Their position is nuanced, cautious. Yes, they say, the British must not use social reform as a weapon to divide and rule. Yes, laws alone cannot change hearts. But how can they, as Hindus and as human beings, remain silent when girls are dying in childbirth at the age of 13? Pune splits. In the bazaar, people shout Tilak's name. His speeches are repeated, exaggerated, carried into the chawls and courtyards. Gokhale's arguments appear in pamphlets, in measured articles, and are read by a few hundred. For the first time, the rivalry acquires flesh. Same city, same caste. Even, once upon a time, the same institution, the Deccan Education Society. But now Tilak's path is lined with crowds, drums, and slogans, while Gokhale walks a narrower road lined with frowns and whispers that he is becoming too English in his thinking. This is the terrain on which Gokhale chooses to fight, not where he is loved, but where he believes he is right. The battle is not only out in public, it begins to seep inward into the very institution that brought them together. The Deccan Education Society, with its proud dream of Indian-controlled education, becomes a quiet battlefield. Tilak, fiery and uncompromising, insists that the society must remain completely independent of government aid, even if it means financial pain. Gokhale, who has stared at more budgets than anyone else, sees the danger of this rigidity. He knows what starvation looks like, knows what it is to have a lamp go out because there is no money for oil. He argues that some cooperation, some grants are acceptable if they can keep the doors of education open for poor Indians. To Tilak, this sounds like dilution. To Gokhale, Tilak's stance sounds like a luxury that the children of clerks and farmers cannot afford. Committee meetings stretch late into the night. Minutes are written, debated, rewritten. Voices are raised. On the surface, they are arguing about financial policy and administrative control. Underneath, they are arguing about the soul of the freedom movement itself, purity of resistance or flexibility in pursuit of a long-term goal. Placed between his mentor Ranade and his colleague Tilak, Gokhale chooses Ranade's path. He does something else that will later look, to some, like a contradiction. While Tilak owns Kesari and Maharata, there is a period in the early 1890s when Gokhale works behind the scenes, contributing to Maharata, helping with its English-language voice. The relationship between the two men is not a clean line of enemy and ally. It is a tangled thread of temporary alliances, intellectual respect, and growing ideological distance. Sometimes they sit in the same office, sharing tea, passing proofs across the table. One writes thunder, the other writes ice. Through all this, Gokhale's standing in the Indian National Congress begins to rise, not because he makes grand speeches from the main stage, but because he is in the committee rooms where drafts are hammered out. He becomes one of those indispensable men whose names rarely appear in the newspapers, but whose handwriting fills every margin of every important document. Resolutions on provincial councils, on taxation, on representation. Somewhere in those commas and clauses is Gokhale's quiet touch. Senior leaders notice. They see the way he picks apart a budget in conversation, the way he can, without looking at notes, recall revenue figures from 5 different provinces. At session after session, he is pulled into drafting committees, finance subgroups, provincial delegations. In 1895, he becomes Joint Secretary of the Indian National Congress, one of the gears that makes the vast annual machinery turn. But each promotion, each added responsibility is also a shortening of his personal timeline. There is a winter evening when, after a long day of college duties and Congress work, he collapses into a coughing fit so violent that a colleague instinctively thinks he is choking. Blood spots his handkerchief. They rush him to a doctor who listens to his lungs with a stethoscope brought from some London manufacturer. The diagnosis is vague: weakness of the chest, overwork, a warning of what tuberculosis can become if provoked. The advice again is simple: rest, fresh air, less strain. The choice again is not simple at all. Gokhale returns to his desk. If anything, the growing opposition between his moderate line and Tilak's extremism pushes him harder. Because every month that goes by, Tilak's star burns brighter. Then disaster strikes Pune. In the late 1890s, plague creeps into the city like a silent assassin. First a few unexplained deaths, then entire lanes emptied, then carts rumbling at night with bodies. The British response is brutal. Under a special plague committee, white soldiers and officials burst into Indian homes, drag out the sick, burn belongings, violate privacy in the name of hygiene. For men who have already felt humiliated by foreign rule, this is a final insult. Anger boils over. 3 young Indian men, the Chapakar brothers and their associate, assassinate the plague commissioner, W.C. Rand, and a military officer. They wait in the dark on a June night in 1897, squeeze the trigger and run. Within months they are caught and hanged. The shockwaves from those drops of blood spread across the country. Tilak writes fiercely in Kesari, criticizing the British high-handedness that led to such extremity. The government retaliates, dragging him to court on charges of sedition. In a hot courtroom, a British judge reads out lines from his editorials as if they are bombs. The sentence is harsh, 18 months rigorous imprisonment. When Tilak comes out of jail, he is no longer merely Bal Gangadhar Tilak. He is Lokmanya, the man accepted by the people, the hero who suffered for the nation. For Gokhale, the twist is cruel. The very violence and repression he fears are feeding the popularity of his rival. Crowds understand the language of martyrdom much more easily than the language of budgets and reform. In political terms, prison has made Tilak stronger. On paper, Gokhale is rising, deeper in Congress, closer to the levers of power. In the streets, his influence is delicate, overshadowed by the man whose path he cannot follow. And yet, even in this tilted landscape, the British government of Bombay can see something they find useful in him. They are under pressure, from London, from economic realities, from the mere fact that India is becoming harder to rule by the day. They need Indians who can sit in councils, who can give them the appearance of consultation while also helping them understand native opinion. So in 1899, they do something that will make many nationalists suspicious. They nominate Gopal Krishna Gokhale to the Bombay Legislative Council. On the face of it, this is a triumph. The boy who could barely afford oil for a lamp will now have a seat in the chamber where laws are debated and budgets passed. He will be able to challenge British officials face to face with the full force of his statistics and logic. But for a movement built on distrust of British motives, the nomination looks like a poisoned chalice. Tilak's followers mutter, "See? This is what moderation leads to. A comfortable chair in a government hall." Others ask, not entirely unfairly, whether a man can serve the cause of Indian self-government while sitting inside the very institutions of foreign rule. Gokhale hears every whisper. He could refuse, make a spectacle of his rejection, earn instant applause from the extremists. Instead, he accepts and justifies it to himself in the most ruthless way possible. If his lifespan is limited, he cannot waste years building an alternative platform when a ready-made one is being placed under his feet. Every year in that council could be worth 10 years of street agitation if he uses it properly. The first day he enters the council chamber is everything his village boyhood could not have imagined. The floors are cool stone, the ceilings high, the walls lined with oil portraits of British grandees. The Indian members are dressed in a mix of Western suits and Indian turbans, each costume a small essay on compromise and pride. He takes his seat, a little apart, papers clutched in a damp hand. He is, after all, still that thin man whose voice rarely rises above conversation level. The British officials do not yet know what is coming. His first interventions are careful, respectful, almost shy in tone. But the content is not shy at all. He questions land revenue in drought-stricken districts. He asks how, in a famine year, the government can justify sending crores of rupees out of India as home charges, the polite phrase, for paying British pensions, British wars, British luxuries. There is a moment, small to those present, huge in the story of a nation, when for the first time in that chamber, an Indian representative stands up and reads out a list of military expenditures alongside the number of schools closed for lack of funds. He does not shout. He simply places the two columns against each other, in the air. A few Englishmen frown. One or two smile thinly as if indulging a clever child. But one or two others, men who have seen poor villagers in their districts, shift in their chairs. They will remember his name. Outside, the clash with Tilak hardens. In 1899, as plague, famine, and resentment swirl through Western India, the Deccan Education Society crisis reaches breaking point. Differences in educational philosophy and control turn inevitably into differences about politics. Gokhale, seen as too close to Renaud's cautious liberalism and now tainted in some eyes by his position in the council, finds himself outvoted, outmaneuvered. In a meeting whose minutes will never capture its emotional weight, Gopal Krishna Gokhale resigns his post at Ferguson College. He walks away from the institution he helped build, from the classrooms where he had planned to spend his life shaping young minds. For a man who once believed education was his primary battlefield, it is like leaving a part of his body behind on the table. The twist is brutal but clarifying. If he cannot fight this battle from the relative safety of a college, he will fight it in the open, in councils, in Congress, in the press, in every forum he can find. The soft-spoken teacher becomes, almost against his own temperament, a full-time public man. By the turn of the century, he is known across India as an emerging authority on finance and constitutional reform. At Congress sessions, delegates now make sure to attend when that Pune man is scheduled to speak. His speeches still require the audience to lean in, but those who do are rewarded with a kind of clarity they have not heard before. Damp statistics turned into moral thunder. In a country where millions cannot read, where most have never seen a budget, he makes the invisible chains visible. At home, however, his body keeps sending reminders that it cannot be stretched indefinitely. Long train journeys to attend sessions leave him exhausted. A simple cold turns quickly into fever. Sometimes, lying awake in the dark, listening to his own labored breathing, he calculates not percentages and deficits, but time. He is in his 30s now. Renaud, his great mentor, is aging. Tilak, just a few years older, seems untiring, feeding on the energy of the crowds that shout his name. The British Empire itself is creaking at the edges, fighting in South Africa, facing new powers in Europe. History is accelerating, and he has to run faster than his lungs allow. In 1901, another blow. Renaud dies. The man who first showed him that facts could be weapons, that moderation could be courage, that reform could be radical, is gone. At the funeral, as the body is carried through the streets of Pune, Gokhale walks with the mourners, face set, eyes hollowed by more than grief. He knows exactly what his mentor's death means. There is now a vacuum at the heart of the moderate movement, a throne of thorns that someone will have to occupy. If he does not step up, Tilak and men like him will fill the space with a very different kind of politics. The clock ticks louder. It is in this moment of personal loss and political urgency that opportunity comes knocking again, this time from even higher up the imperial staircase. In 1902, the Viceroy's government in Calcutta looks around for Indians to nominate to the Imperial Legislative Council, the central body where all India laws are framed, where the grand budget of the entire subcontinent is debated. Their eyes settle on the man from Pune who has already been making unwelcome trouble in Bombay's council with his detailed economic criticisms. When the nomination arrives, it is both an honor and a challenge. The Imperial Legislative Council is a theater of power unlike anything Gokhale has seen. The highest officials of the Raj, the Viceroy, himself, senior civil servants whose signatures can redraw provincial boundaries. If Bombay was a rehearsal, this is the main stage. Friends debate the offer with him. Some warn that London will use him as a showpiece. Look, we have Indians in our councils. What more do they want? Others argue that if he walks into that hall armed with his facts and his moral clarity, he can do more to expose the injustices of the system than 100 speeches outside. Once again, he chooses the path that looks to some like collaboration, and to him like the only realistic way to compress a century, is work into the few decades his heart will allow. Early one morning, as the mist still hangs low over the tracks, a thin figure with a rolled-up blanket and a worn leather bag climbs onto a train bound for Calcutta. His spectacles are smudged, his cough rattles a little. In the compartment, other passengers chat idly about business, about family, about the weather. He sits by the window watching the countryside stream past, fields where peasants bent double in the sun, villages where children wave at trains without knowing that the decisions about their salt, their land, their hunger will now be influenced by one of the men on board. He opens a notebook. On one page, he writes in careful English, "Memorandum on land revenue, points to be raised." On the other, perhaps without fully admitting it even to himself, he writes something else, a silent calculation of how many years he might have left, how many budgets he will be able to dissect before his own body gives way. The race is now fully joined between a dying man's lungs and a dying empire's arrogance, between moderation and extremism, between the whisper of reason and the roar of rebellion. As the train drives eastward toward the capital of the Raj, Gopal Krishna Gokhale tightens his scarf against the morning chill and turns another page, stepping without fanfare into the ring where he will spend the rest of his short life trying to persuade an empire to listen before it is too late. On a humid afternoon in Calcutta, under the glittering chandeliers of the Imperial Legislative Council, the British Empire thinks it is in complete control. Rows of officials in stiff collars, generals with rows of medals, high civil servants with neatly folded papers. This is the brain of the Raj, the place where India's fate is supposed to be decided calmly, rationally, and safely. Then a thin Indian in a simple black coat rises to speak. He does not look dangerous. He adjusts his spectacles with fingers that tremble slightly from fatigue. His voice, when it begins, is low, almost apologetic. But within minutes, you can feel something shift in that room. Because while everyone else is talking about administration and efficiency, Gopal Krishna Gokhale is talking about dead bodies. Softly, precisely, he begins listing figures. How many crores, he asks, have we spent this year on the army? And how many lakhs on primary schools? How much on barracks? And how much on famine relief, when 5 million of His Majesty's Indian subjects have died of hunger in the last decade? He is not inventing these numbers. They come from the government's own blue books. He pauses. The silence is audible. Somewhere in the gallery, a clerk stops taking notes and just stares. In that instant, the Imperial Legislative Council is no longer a safe British debating club. It is a courtroom, and the empire itself is in the dock. This is what Gokhale has come to Calcutta to do, to turn the empire's own reports into an indictment, to use its beloved arithmetic as a weapon against it, and he has to do it fast. By the time he enters the Imperial Council in 1902, his doctors are already warning him plainly. His lungs are weak, his heart strained. If he goes on like this, they tell him he may not live another 10 or 15 years. He smiles politely, thanks them, and increases his workload. From the first day in that grand chamber, he walks a razor's edge. To his British colleagues, he is at first the reasonable Indian, articulate, courteous, apparently willing to work within the constitutional framework. To many nationalists outside, he already looks like a man who has crossed a line, accepted a place inside the machinery of foreign rule. But they all underestimate just how ruthlessly he plans to use that position. His first budget speech in the Imperial Council is a quiet revolution. No theatrics, no raised voice, just a devastating cascade of comparisons. He holds up not flags or slogans, but ledgers. On one page, rupees spent on military expeditions in Tibet, Afghanistan, Africa. On the facing page, rupees allocated to village schools in India. He forces the council to read those two pages together. Every extra lakh for the army, he says calmly, is a lakh taken from the stomach of the Indian peasant. It is a sentence that will be quoted in newspapers across the subcontinent. British officials shift in their seats. Some dismiss him as a sentimental idealist. Others, more honest with themselves, feel a chill. For the first time, they see their own budget as a map of moral failure. The Anglo-Indian press gives him a backhanded compliment. Mr. Gokhale is perhaps the most formidable financial critic that the government has yet faced. He notes the phrase, formidable critic, and files it away, not as a trophy, but as a weapon he can sharpen further. But every speech, every late-night calculation is time stolen from his own body. In his small lodging in Calcutta, he coughs through the nights. Sometimes the fit is so violent he has to grip the table to stay upright. A friend, alarmed, rushes him again to a doctor. This time the words are blunt. If you continue at this pace, you are burning your life at both ends. 10 years, perhaps less. Take rest, or the work will bury you. He does not argue. He simply walks back to his desk and spreads out another set of papers. Land revenue returns from United Provinces, salt tax figures. From Madras, railway freight statistics from Bombay. If time is short, the only answer is to use it more fiercely. While he is learning to strike in Calcutta, India itself is heading toward an explosion. In 1905, Lord Curzon slices Bengal in two. On paper, the partition is an administrative measure. In reality, nearly 80 million people wake up to find their province split along religious and linguistic lines. To millions of Bengalis, it feels like amputation and like deliberate divide and rule. The reaction is volcanic. Crowds pour into the streets of Calcutta chanting Bande Mataram. Foreign cloth is thrown into bonfires. The word Swadeshi, of one's own country, becomes a battle cry. This is a moment tailor-made for Bal Gangadhar Tilak. In western India, Tilak seizes the thunder of Bengal and hurls it into the Maharashtrian sky. His papers roar for boycott of British goods, for national education, for passive resistance that is only a step away from open confrontation. Gokhale in Calcutta is just as furious about the partition. He calls it the worst and most callous measure of bureaucratic autocracy. He denounces it in the council, writes memoranda, meets officials, warns London that they are playing with fire, but the contrast is stark. Tilak's anger fills streets. Gokhale's anger fills official minutes. Once again, their rivalry sharpens. Two men, same love for India, utterly different weapons. One wields mass emotion, the other wields constitutional pressure. And now the stakes are national. It is in this charged atmosphere that, in 1905, the Indian National Congress chooses Gopal Krishna Gokhale as its president. The session at Benares is a sea of white caps and colored turbans, of banners from every corner of the country. As he rises to speak from the presidential chair, a frail man in a simple coat, looking almost shy under the garlands, a hush falls over the pandal. His presidential address is not a cry for instant revolution. It is something in some ways more dangerous, a precise reasoned demand for self-government. He speaks of Swaraj not as a vague dream but as a concrete political goal, responsible government for Indians within the empire in no distant future. No distant future. The phrase hangs in the air. It sounds mild, almost gentle. But for a man who has started counting his own remaining years, it is as radical as any clenched fist. Outside, extremists whisper that his Swaraj is too timid, that within the empire is a chain, not a promise. Inside, British officials whisper that he is going too far, too fast. He walks out of the Benares session knowing two things. One, he is now, whether he likes it or not, the principal face of moderate nationalism in India. Two, he cannot rely on politicians alone to carry this weight. If Congress meets once a year, if MLAs speak a few days a month, what happens in all the other days, in all the other years, in the villages where no one has ever heard a budget speech? He needs an army, not of soldiers, but of servants. So in 1905, back in Pune, in a modest rented house lit by a single lamp, he gathers a small group of idealistic young men. They are not impressed by titles or offices. They are drawn to him because of something more severe, the idea of a life given entirely to the country. He lays a sheet of paper on the table. It is not a political manifesto. It is a vow. They will form a new organization, the Servants of India Society. Its conditions are as strict as any religious order. Members must treat the service of India as their religion. They must be prepared to give up lucrative careers, live on a tiny fixed allowance, avoid accumulation of property, and accept that public work, not family life, will be their central duty. Some of them are stunned. This is not the politics of speeches and applause. This is the politics of renunciation, a lifetime of travel by third-class compartments, of dusty meetings in school courtyards, of explaining basic civic rights to peasants who have never seen a newspaper. Gokhale is asking for nothing less than their whole life, and he leads by example. He himself lives with Spartan simplicity, a narrow bed, a writing desk, stacks of papers. Whatever salary he draws is swallowed by travel, postage, and the society's work. In an age when many Indian notables enjoy the quiet comforts of colonial collaboration, he chooses instead a kind of chosen poverty. At night, after a day in the council, he returns to the society's quarters and becomes a teacher again. He trains his young recruits in history, economics, constitutional law. He drills them on facts. How many people in this district are literate? How many schools exist? How many days' work a peasant must do to pay the land revenue? Never go to the people with vague ideas, he tells them. Go with figures, go with solutions. Go to them as if every village is your classroom and you are responsible for every child in it. The work is exhilarating and brutal. He is now carrying 3 full-time burdens: Imperial Council member in Calcutta, national leader in the Congress, and founder-mentor of a new order of social workers. And the clock is ticking louder. Late one night, after a grueling train journey and a day of speeches, he feels a sudden tightness in his chest, so sharp it makes him gasp. The room tilts. For a few terrifying seconds, his vision blurs. A companion insists on summoning a doctor. This time there is no gentle phrasing. Your heart is enlarged. Your lungs are permanently weakened. If you do not slow down, you may have only a handful of years left, 5, perhaps 10. You must choose between your work and your life. He lies awake after the doctor leaves, staring at the ceiling. Choose between his work and his life? For Gokhale, that is not a real choice at all. His work is his life. Without it, the remaining years would be empty. So in the morning, he gets up, folds his blanket carefully, and catches the 6 a.m. train to the next engagement. As his body weakens, the political storm he has dreaded breaks over the Congress. The years after Bengal's partition see a rapid rise of extremist influence. Young India is impatient. The slow grind of petitions and council debates seems too small, too polite, for a nation bleeding under foreign rule. At the 1906 Calcutta session, under the Venerable Dadabhai Naoroji, the word Swaraj is officially adopted as the Congress's goal. In the pavilion, moderates and extremists sit side by side, clapping. In the committee rooms behind the stage, they are fighting over every comma. Tilak and his allies want Swaraj to mean complete self-rule, pursued through boycott, national education, passive resistance. Gokhale and his colleagues want to keep the movement tied, at least for now, to constitutional methods. The split is no longer theoretical. It is personal, tactical, urgent. In 1907, it explodes. The Congress meets at Surat, Tilak's backyard, extremist territory. The choice of president becomes a proxy war. Extremists push for Lajpat Rai or Tilak, men who will endorse their more confrontational program. Moderates rally around Rash Behari Ghosh, a safe constitutionalist candidate, clearly Gokhale's man. The atmosphere inside the tent is electric and brittle. On the day of the presidential election, the air is thick with sweat and slogans. Extremists shout, "Tilak Maharaj ki jai." Moderates demand order. The chairman, struggling to make himself heard, calls for calm. It takes one small spark. A group surges toward the platform. Someone shouts an insult. A hand reaches for the microphone. A chair is raised. In seconds, the Congress, the great national platform of unity, becomes a battlefield. Chairs fly through the air. Turbans are knocked off. Delegates who have spent their lives writing polite memoranda now find themselves ducking wooden missiles in their own political temple. On the dais, Gokhale watches, shocked and sickened. This is his nightmare. The national movement tearing itself apart while the British watch and smile. When the dust finally settles, there is no president, no resolution, no united Congress. There is only the smell of betrayal. Moderates and extremists walk out by different doors. The split is complete. In the following months, the British exploit the fracture with cold efficiency. They crack down on the extremists with new ferocity. In 1908, after a series of bomb incidents in Bengal and Maharashtra, they haul Tilak back to court on sedition charges, quoting his editorials as if they are dynamite. This time, the sentence is savage. 6 years transportation to Mandalay jail in Burma. Crowds weep outside the courthouse. For them, Tilak becomes a living martyr, a man exiled for demanding India's freedom. For Gokhale, the moment is a bitter tangle of emotions. On one hand, he is horrified by the brutality of the punishment, by the way the government uses law as a weapon to silence a political opponent. He stands up in council and denounces such repression, warns that imprisonment cannot kill an idea. On the other hand, with Tilak far away in a Burmese prison, the fiercest voice against him is removed from the field. His path inside councils and committees is suddenly less obstructed. It is a twisted kind of relief, laced with guilt. The British, eager to strengthen the moderate wing they find more manageable, now turn even more toward Gokhale. In London, the Liberal government of John Morley, under pressure from growing unrest in India and criticism at home, begins to consider constitutional concessions. Who better to consult than the man whom even imperial officials now grudgingly respect? In 1908-1909, Gokhale travels to Britain. The journey itself is an ordeal. He boards the steamer already exhausted, his chest raw from constant speaking. The damp, bone-chilling English winter is the worst possible climate for his lungs. And yet in London drawing rooms and committee chambers, he is at his sharpest. He moves from one meeting to another, coat wrapped tight, muffler around his thin neck, sitting face to face with men who hold the levers of power over India. He gives evidence before parliamentary committees, meets Morley, engages with radical MPs who are sympathetic to India's cause. He does what he always does. He uses numbers as knives. He tells them how much of India's revenue is drained every year as home charges to pay British pensions and debts. He explains that in some districts the average Indian earns barely enough to survive, yet is taxed on salt, the most basic necessity of life. He points out that while British children back home are guaranteed basic schooling, in India 9 out of 10 children never see the inside of a classroom. Is this, he asks quietly, the civilizing mission that you so proudly proclaim? Some of his listeners are unmoved, but some are shaken. Morley, a complex man torn between imperial loyalty and liberal conscience, begins to see that something has to change, if only to save the empire from itself. The result in 1909 is the Morley-Minto reforms. On paper, they look significant. Expanded legislative councils, a few more elected Indian members, a timid increase in the power to discuss budgets and move resolutions. For many extremists, they are an insult, crumbs tossed to a starving nation. For Gokhale, they are dangerously small, but they are also cracks in the wall he has been hammering at for 20 years. He knows that without those cracks, no light can enter at all. Back in the Imperial Council, he wastes no time using the new powers. In 1910, he introduces what will become one of his most famous and heartbreaking proposals, a bill for free and compulsory primary education in India. He does not frame it as an abstract right. He frames it as a matter of survival. He quotes figures that make even hardened officials wince. In some provinces, only 1 child in 20 goes to school. Entire villages with hundreds of children share a single teacher, or none at all. He paints pictures of boys and girls walking miles barefoot, only to be turned away because there are no funds for more benches, more chalk, more slates. In a moment of cold moral arithmetic, he lays out the cost. For the price of 1 battleship, he says, you could educate millions of Indian children. What is the greater security for the empire? Steel in the sea or light in the minds of its people? It is one of the most powerful speeches of his life. It is also a failure. The government benches, obedient to the Viceroy and the Secretary of State, vote the bill down. They call it premature, too expensive, impractical. The proposal collapses under the weight of the word no. When he walks out of the council chamber that day, witnesses say he looks older by years. To some, it seems as if he has lost. But in villages far from Calcutta, young men of his Servants of India Society, inspired by his vision, begin setting up small schools. Anyway, in temple courtyards, under trees, in borrowed rooms. The state may have rejected his bill. India has not. By now, his name carries a strange dual image. To British officials, he is both dangerously persuasive and usefully moderate. To some young nationalists inflamed by stories of revolution in Russia and Ireland, he looks like a tired old man begging for reforms when they want to seize them. He can feel history changing gears beneath his feet. The age of conspiracies and secret societies, of strikes and mass protests, is coming. The age of careful, devastating budget speeches may be passing, and his body is failing. After one late-night debate, he returns to his room and cannot remove his own shoes. He sits on the bed, gasping, fingers numb. A colleague has to help him undress. The same doctor's verdict returns in his mind. 5 years, 10 at most. But he also knows something else. Somewhere, far away in South Africa, an Indian lawyer he once met briefly in Bombay has been following his speeches, reading his pamphlets, quoting his ideas of nonviolent constitutional struggle. Soon that man will return to India and seek Gokhale as a mentor. Time is running out, for his lungs, for the empire, for the old moderate politics. And yet, in those brief remaining years, he still has one more task: to pass the torch to a new generation before the darkness catches up with him. He tightens his shawl around his thin frame, reaches for his papers, and prepares for the next train, the next speech, the next attempt, to squeeze decades of progress into the handful of years his frail heart has left. On the day British bullets tear through the crowd at Jallianwala Bagh, when men, women, and children collapse in a bloody heap on the dusty ground, there is one man who is not there to see his darkest warning come true. He has been dead for 4 years. Yet in the mind of Mohandas Karamchand Gandhi, as news of the massacre reaches him, one voice rises above the screams and gunshots, soft, precise, almost professor-like. Never let hatred enter the struggle. If India wins its freedom with hatred, she will not know what to do with it. That voice belongs to Gopal Krishna Gokhale. By 1919, he is only a memory. But that memory is steering the man who will soon be called the father of the nation. To understand how a frail, overworked, moderate politician who died in 1915 helped shape the road to 1947, you have to go back to a thin figure standing on the deck of a ship in 1912, shivering in the sea wind, clutching the railing as if he is holding on to time itself. The ship is bound for South Africa. Gokhale should not be on it. His lungs rattle, his heart is enlarged. Doctors have told him, almost mathematically, no more than 3 to 5 years if you continue like this. He hears the number, weighs it like a statistic in one of his budget speeches, and books the passage anyway, because at the other end of this voyage is a young lawyer who has been writing to him for years, sending cuttings of his speeches, to a newspaper in Durban calling him my master in politics, begging him to come. The lawyer's name, printed in earnest, cramped handwriting on countless envelopes, is M. K. Gandhi. Gokhale has seen Tilak's India, the processions, the boycotts, the slogans shouted with clenched fists. Now he wants to see Gandhi's India in exile, an Indian community fighting a racist regime on another continent. If Tilak's path is one answer to the question, how should a nation fight? Perhaps Gandhi's path can become another, and if Gokhale does not guide that path now, he knows exactly who will owe. Someone with Tilak's fire, but without Gokhale's restraint. Someone who might set the country alight and never learn how to put the fire out. So he leans into the cold wind on the ship's deck and whispers to himself, almost like a promise. These may be the last years, then they must be used to shape the next 50. When he lands in South Africa, the welcome is overwhelming. The Indian community there has been waiting for him like a prophet. Garlands, speeches, cheers. Men and women travel for days to catch a glimpse of the famous Indian from Pune who dares to stand up to the British in their own councils. But Gandhi does not bring him first to a reception. He brings him to a railway station. He shows him the bench from which he was thrown off for daring to sit in a whites-only carriage. He walks him through neighborhoods where Indians must carry passes like criminals, where policemen can enter their homes whenever they please. Gokhale listens, face pale. He has read reports of South Africa. He has seen the numbers, how many Indians whipped for refusing to register, how many merchants bankrupted by racist laws. But numbers are not the same as a man pointing to a scar on his own body. In little meeting halls lit by oil lamps, he watches Gandhi address miners and hawkers in halting Gujarati and English mixed together. There are no grand stages, no printed banners, just tired men with tired eyes, listening as if their lives depend on it. What stuns Gokhale is not just their suffering. It is Gandhi's method. This young lawyer is telling them to resist, but not to hit back. To go to jail, but not to curse. To face the government, but never to nurture hatred in their hearts. Satyagraha, holding on to truth. Gokhale hears in that word an echo of something he has always believed but never named. For days the two men talk, late into the night, over simple meals, on long walks where Gokhale must stop every few minutes to catch his breath. Gandhi bombards him with questions. What should be the first demand we make of the British? Is it enough to ask for rights as British subjects, or must we demand Swaraj outright? How far can nonviolence go when the state is violent? Gokhale does not give him easy answers. He speaks instead in careful, relentless lines. Remember, Mohan, India is not just Bombay or Calcutta. It is 600,000 villages. A nation that starves cannot sustain heroics for long. First, understand her poverty. Second, educate her children. Third, make sure that whatever method you choose can be followed by the weakest man, not just the bravest. He tells Gandhi something else, more personal. You have the moral passion that Tilak has. You can move crowds. But promise me you will never use that power to release hatred. Promise me you will bind it to discipline. Gandhi, who has seen men beaten senseless in South Africa, who has felt a volcano of rage in himself, nods slowly. I promise, he says. They both know time is short. Gandhi can see it in Gokhale's cough, in the way he leans on the armrest after climbing even a few steps. He insists that his mentor rest, eat better, slow down. Gokhale smiles, that tired, ironic smile of his. When we have a free India, he says, I will rest for an entire year. Both of them know they are talking about a future that he will never see. When he returns to India, the air itself feels heavier. In Bombay, in Pune, in Calcutta, the name Tilak is once again being shouted in the streets like a war drum, even though its owner is still in a jail cell in distant Mandalay. Tilak's articles, smuggled out or reprinted, circulate like forbidden pamphlets. Young men whisper his slogan, "Swaraj is my birthright and I shall have it," as if it were a secret prayer. Gokhale feels the pressure like a hand on his chest. His rival is absent but more present than ever. The moderates are mocked as petition writers. The servants of India society is dismissed by some as a band of harmless schoolteachers. He can almost hear the ticking of an invisible clock, not just his own failing heart, but the time left before anger, left unchecked, turns into something uncontrollable, so he throws himself even harder into work. He travels from province to province, mapping India's poverty like a physician mapping wounds. In Bengal, he hears famine survivors tell him how they sold their last cooking pot to pay land revenue. In Punjab, he watches peasants stare blankly at tax receipts they cannot read. In Madras, he visits a village school where 60 children share 12 battered slates. Everywhere, he asks the same question: how can a people in such a condition survive a violent revolution? They will not have the strength to get up again. This is not cowardice. It is cold, brutal calculation from a man who knows exactly how many calories of food, how many pays of tax, how many hours of work stand between a peasant and his grave. In 1914, 2 thunderclaps strike in quick succession. The first is joyful to millions. Bal Gangadhar Tilak walks out of Mandalay jail, thinner, older, but with eyes that still burn. He is greeted in Bombay like a returning king. Crowds pour garlands over him until his carriage is almost buried in flowers. The cry "Tilak Maharaj ki jai" echoes off the walls. The second thunderclap rolls in from Europe. War. In August, the great powers of the West fall upon each other like beasts. Trenches, shells, gas, a kind of mechanized slaughter the world has never seen. The British Empire begins to mobilize its vast resources, its colonies, not just for peace and order, but for survival. Now the question in India is brutally simple. What should a subject nation do when its ruler is fighting for its life? Tilak's followers whisper, this is the moment to strike a bargain or strike chains. Secret groups talk of taking advantage of Britain's distraction. Some radicals dream of an uprising aided by Germany. All eyes turn to men like Gokhale. He does something that will make him, in the eyes of many extremists, unforgivable. He calls upon Indians to support the British war effort, not out of love for the empire, out of cold strategic leverage. He believes, perhaps in hindsight with tragic optimism, that if India sheds blood and treasure for Britain now, if Indian soldiers die in Flanders and Mesopotamia under the Union Jack, then Britain will be morally trapped. When the guns fall silent, they will have to offer India real constitutional reform. It is a gamble with millions of lives as chips. In public, he phrases it carefully. We must show that we are not asking for rights in order to weaken the empire in its hour of trial, but to strengthen it by making India a willing partner instead of an unwilling subject. In private, he is more blunt. If they do not reward such loyalty, he tells a friend, they will teach Indians forever that only rebellion works. Then Tilak's path will be the only path left. The reaction is ferocious. Extremist newspapers accuse him of selling India's soul for British praise. Young nationalists spit the word moderate like an insult. Tilak himself, though more cautious after Mandalay, cannot resist criticizing the idea that India should trust promises made in wartime. The old rivalry flares, now not just over methods, but over a nation's choice in the face of global catastrophe. But Gokhale has no time to defend himself. Quite literally. In late 1914, his health finally collapses. He can no longer climb stairs without stopping twice. Simple speeches leave him drained, gasping for air. A persistent cough now brings up flecks of blood. His doctors, who have been warning him for years, drop all pretense. Mr. Gokhale, one says, if you try to go through another full session of the Imperial Council, it may kill you. Your heart is swollen, your lungs are fighting for breath. You must stop. For the first time, the thought enters his mind, not as an abstract possibility, but as a physical sensation. He might not see another monsoon. And yet, there is one more task that will not let him go. In January 1915, a quiet, almost unnoticed figure returns to India after 2 decades abroad. Mohandas Karamchand Gandhi, now 45, steps off the ship in Bombay, dressed simply, carrying very little, his reputation still, confined to those who have followed the South African struggle. He does not go first to the Viceroy or to the Congress. He goes to Pune, he goes to Gopal Krishna Gokhale. By now, Gokhale is living almost like a semi-invalid, wrapped in shawls, moving from chair to bed, surrounded by papers he can no longer fully conquer. He looks like a man whom time has already begun to erase. When Gandhi enters the room, he does something very un-Indian for a barrister trained in London. He bows low and says simply, "You are my political guru." For a moment, the frail man on the bed is overcome. All his life, he has been fighting two enemies at once, the empire outside and despair inside his own camp. Despair that moderation is weakness, that patience is surrender. Here, at last, is a disciple who has seen jails, batons, and racism in their naked form, and who still believes that the struggle must be bound by truth and nonviolence. They talk for hours. Gandhi outlines his experiences, his experiments with satyagraha, his belief that nonviolent resistance can break even the hardest government. Gokhale listens, nods, occasionally closing his eyes as if from pain, then opening them again with a flash of intensity. He gives Gandhi his last and perhaps most important instruction. Do not plunge into politics at once, he says. Travel for a year. See India with your own eyes. Not as a leader, but as a student. Live in her villages. Understand her caste, her poverty, her fear. Only then will you know what methods she can truly bear. Gandhi agrees. It is a vow that will shape his first crucial years in India, those quiet journeys through Champaran, Kedah, Ahmedabad, where he will test, refine, and finally unleash the mass satyagraha that will rock the Raj. Before he leaves, Gandhi asks for something more intangible. Bapuji, he says. He has begun to call Gokhale that little father. Will you not give me your blessing? Gokhale raises a trembling hand and lays it on Gandhi's head. We do not know exactly what he thought in that moment, but we know this. He had finally found the one person who might carry his moral arithmetic forward, who might combine Tilak's ability to rouse the multitude with Gokhale's insistence on restraint, on thought, on statistics, on seeing the poorest man in the crowd. As the measure of every decision, he had at last someone to lose time to. A few weeks later, on a cold February morning in 1915 in a modest house in Pune, the clock runs out. Gopal Krishna Gokhale dies at the age of 48. No office in the land carries his name. He leaves behind no fortune, no dynasty, no palace. He leaves behind some trunks of papers, a thin mattress, worn clothes, and an organization of young men and women bound by a vow to serve India in obscurity. At his funeral, the contrast that has marked his life appears again. There are princes and lawyers, school teachers and coolies, British officials with stiff faces and Indian peasants with tears streaming down their cheeks. Bal Gangadhar Tilak, his old rival, pays public tribute, calling him a great man, a sincere patriot. Mohandas Gandhi is shattered. He writes later that, in losing Gokhale, he feels as if he has lost a limb, as if his support has been snatched away before the time. India moves on. War intensifies. New leaders rise. The Congress, still fractured, gropes toward unity. Tilak throws himself into the Home Rule League, pushing for his self-government during the war. The Servants of India Society, under men like Srinivasa Sastry, continues its quiet work, opening schools, fighting child marriage, speaking in legislatures with the same cool precision their founder taught them. And yet, in the years after his death, the strangest thing happens. In the great contest Gokhale fought all his life, not against the British, but against the idea that only violence and rage can make history, it begins to look as if the man who lost the battles is winning the war. In 1916, at Lucknow, the Congress and the Muslim League sign a pact, carefully balancing Hindu-Muslim representation. The man guiding much of the League's side, Muhammad Ali Jinnah, is a disciple of Gokhale's school of constitutional argument. In 1917, the British government issues the Montague Declaration, promising progressive realization of responsible government in India. On paper, it is vague. In spirit, it is an admission that the empire cannot go on as before. The intellectual groundwork for that admission lies, unacknowledged, in decades of Gokhale's budget speeches and memoranda. In 1919, after the bloodbath of Jallianwala Bagh, it is not an armed band that shakes the empire to its core. It is Gandhi's nationwide nonviolent hartal, strikes, prayers, peaceful processions, from Karachi to Kashi, and in every leaflet urging non-cooperation without hatred, in every insistence that protesters must accept beatings without retaliation, and there is the faint, firm echo of an old man in Pune saying, "Promise me you will bind power to discipline." Even Tilak, in his last years before his death in 1920, moves closer to Gokhale's terrain. He contests elections, sits in councils, negotiates with British officials, realizing that mass struggle and constitutional pressure are not two paths but two legs of the same journey. By the time India finally wakes up as an independent nation on 15th of August 1947, the labels of moderate and extremist have long lost their old meanings. In the Constituent Assembly that drafts the new republic's constitution, you can trace the ancestry of ideas like universal primary, education, civil liberties, provincial autonomy, economic planning, not to a single heroic revolutionary, but to a bespectacled professor from Pune who once asked in a cold imperial chamber, how many lakhs for barracks and how many for schools? His Servants of India Society still exists, smaller, quieter, but stubborn. A few hundred men and women teaching night classes, fighting corruption, training civic volunteers. His name appears in history textbooks, usually in the same sentence as moderate leader, mentor of Gandhi, founder of the Servants of India Society. It sounds tidy, almost dull, but behind those dry phrases lies a life lived as if every speech might be the last, every journey the one that would finally break his heart. The rival he struggled with for decades becomes, in death, a fellow ancestor in the national pantheon. The empire he dissected with numbers collapses under the weight of its own contradictions. The student he blessed becomes a Mahatma. And somewhere between the flying chairs of Surat and the silent discipline of the Salt March, between the thunder of Tilak's slogans and the quiet precision of Gandhi's spinning wheel, the legacy of Gopal Krishna Gokhale runs like a thin, unbroken line, a belief that freedom is not just the absence of foreign rule, but the presence of justice, a conviction that how a nation fights will shape what that nation becomes, and above all, the stark, almost terrifying decision to burn one short, fragile life as a fuse, in the hope that, long after the flame goes out, the explosion of awakening it ignites will keep on echoing, across decades, across generations, across the very idea of India itself.